G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with Australia's Day of National Shame, Part 21, the final episode. This is a book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall, based on his readings of the submissions to and the findings of the Low Royal Commission into the surprise bombing of Darwin by the Japanese on the 19th of February 1942. It was Australian Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck who coined the phrase Australia's Day of National Shame when he was unveiling a plaque on a memorial to the memory of those who died in Darwin during the bombing. In this chapter we have Broome, a familiar story, then concluding with the epilogue. The lesson of Darwin should at least have prompted Australia's military and political leaders far away in the south to look hard at the situation in the west. If the Japanese considered it worth bombarding Darwin with such a huge force, then the four principal towns of northwestern Australia, i.e. Wyndham, Derby, Broome and Port Hedland, must now also be considered extremely vulnerable. But 4 days went by before the War Cabinet even ordered the compulsory evacuation of women and children from Broome, the most vulnerable of the four towns. Broome could expect to be a prime target. As the Australian, British and Dutch forces were pushed further and further back by the Japanese until they had nowhere else to go but Australia, Broome was selected as a major evacuation centre. At the same time, it was the base from which supplies were still being flown into Java, mainly in flying boats, so it was clearly a source of irritation to the Japanese. As late as 25th of February, a Qantas flying boat ferried 1,700 kilograms of machine guns across the Timor Sea to Java. Broome had been selected for this role because it was thought to be safely out of range of the Japanese aircraft that were causing such devastation. But it turned out that this was yet another sum that the strategic planners did wrong, for Broome was very comfortably inside the range even of Zero fighters, fitted as they were with their long-range belly tanks that gave them an effective range of 1,500 kilometres. The town, situated on Roebuck Bay, 2,205 kilometres by road from Perth, was Australia's pearling centre. About 400 luggers made up the pearling fleet, which was crewed by many men from many nations. So cosmopolitan was the population of about 5,500 that street signs were written in Japanese, Chinese, Malay and Arabic, as well as English. But as a flying boat base, it was a very difficult harbour from which to operate. There were no facilities for them to start with, and because of the tides, which rise and fall 10 metres, the moorings had to be laid in the deep water channel more than 1,500 metres from shore. To reach the boat meant an 800-metre walk along a rough jetty, but at low tide this jetty was 10 metres out of the water, so that to get to the flying boats meant climbing down and wading through the mud to a rowing boat, carrying all the baggage and gear. It was a primitive operation. But primitive or not, it handled 8,000 evacuees from Java in the last 2 weeks of February alone, as an armada of flying boats and land-based planes shuttled backwards and forwards between Chilat Jap in Java and Broome. As many as 57 aircraft landed on a single day. On the overcast afternoon of Monday the 2nd of March 1942, a lone Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Broome at about 3,000 metres and circled the town 3 times. Many of those who watched it did so with a sense of foreboding, realising that their reprieve from Darwin's fate was probably coming to an end. Most of the women and all of the children had been evacuated from the town, flying out in aircraft that had brought in munitions and supplies for the American forces. Now, with the warning of the reconnaissance plane, authorities warned the captains of the 17 flying boats that were riding at anchor to refuel as fast as they could and to take off at the first light on the next morning tide. Many ignored the warning and did not even bother to ask for fuel. Many more wanted to refuel, but they couldn't get any petrol when they asked. In spite of its vital importance to the war effort, Broome had primitive and completely inadequate refuelling and servicing facilities. There was only one refuelling lighter, the Nickel Bay, which worked all through the night but could still only refuel 3 of the Dutch flying boats. By breakfast time the following morning only one float plane had bothered to take off, and the commanders of many of the others had refused to attach any great importance to the appearance of the lone aircraft the previous day. Then at precisely 9:20 the Japanese struck with 9 Zeros, cannoning in with guns blazing. Flying line ahead, the Japanese selected their first target, a Qantas flying boat, Centaurus, which was on charter to the RAAF. Explosive bullets ripped through the skin and it burst into flames as the crew who were on board, bracket, the captain was ashore, close bracket, hurriedly climbed into the rubber dinghy. By now other flying boats were on fire and within minutes the scene was indescribable. Everywhere there were flying boats blazing on the water or sinking, with great patches of burning petrol causing the same havoc as the oil had done at Darwin. In the middle of it, men were screaming and crying out, pleading with those on the shore to snatch them out of the inferno. At the end of the jetty, Captain Lewis Ambrose was waiting with 25 passengers to take another Qantas flying boat, the Corinna, down to Port Hedland. As the fighters came in, they threw themselves to the ground and all managed to escape injury. But the Corinna was quickly ablaze. The boat's engineer was out on the wing supervising refuelling when he saw a fighter heading straight for him. He went over the side of the wing into the harbour and heard bullets smashing into the water all around him. He swam away towards an empty dinghy and clambered into it, picking up survivors on the way to the shore. Broome was completely undefended, and the only military personnel there were a few elderly Home Guard men armed with even older .303-inch calibre rifles and a small amount of ammunition. The raid lasted for 20 minutes, but there was some doubt afterwards if the Australian military had fired a single shot in anger. In fact, the only weapon that certainly did fire at the Japanese was a machine gun that had been brought ashore for cleaning by the gunner of a Dutch flying boat. He was so outraged by what he saw that he picked up his gun, loaded it, and then cradled it in his arms and, bracket, receiving severe burns for his forgetfulness, close bracket, blasted away at the Zeros. He was credited with a Zero probably destroyed. A total of 24 aircraft were lost as a result of the raid. After destroying all 16 flying boats at their moorings, 2 Qantas Empires, 2 British and 2 American Catalinas, 3 Dutch Dorniers and 7 others, the Japanese flew on to the aerodrome where they destroyed a further 6 aircraft. Even this was not all, because they shot down a B-24 Liberator shortly after it took off, killing 30 of the 31 people on board, and then a DC-3 which crashed about 100 kilometres north of Broome, taking with it a valuable consignment of diamonds. A single survivor made it back to Broome from the Liberator, a US Marine Corps sergeant who spent 30 hours in the water before eventually swimming to safety. The Liberator had just landed doctors and medical supplies from Perth and was taking a consignment of evacuees south when the alarm sounded. It had tried to beat the Japanese. Total casualties were officially given as about 70 dead, but it was impossible to know if this was accurate, as there may have been twice that number. Only 17 identified bodies were buried, but there was a large number in at least one of the flying boats, none of which was ever identified. 29 still lie unidentified in a large communal grave. Many victims were women and children evacuees on their way south from Timor and Java, and details of their names and even how many there were on board the flying boats that sunk were not known. Air Marshal Richard Williams, who had been in Broome only a few weeks earlier, said later of the raid on the West Australian town, quote, "I cannot think of anything more horrifying than a woman with little children, as there was on this occasion, being caught in these circumstances, perhaps with one in her arms and one or more at her skirts, having to jump into deep water to see them all drown or burn together in a sinking aircraft." Immediately the Liberator crashed, messages flashed between Broome and Perth and Canberra as the United States Air Corps made repeated requests to Western Command in Perth for aircraft to aid in the search for survivors. But they were all refused by the Air Board to whom they were referred. Quote, "It is regretted but inevitable, under present conditions of war, that aircraft cannot be spared for evacuation or for searching for missing aircraft at present," unquote, the board replied. Many Americans who were in Broome on the day of the raid never forgave Australia for that refusal. The Air Board also ordered that no aircraft should be made available for evacuating casualties, or, quote, non-essentials, as the civilians were called, from Broome except with the authority of the General Officer Commanding, and because the military was anxious to keep the healthy men in town for urgent work, it withheld permission. A cipher message was flashed to the Dutch administrator in Perth, telling him that 6 Dutch seaplanes had been destroyed and that evacuation was needed for 676 men and some women. The Dutch were able to fly in relief planes chartered from the south. The town itself was abandoned almost faster than Darwin had been, and there were very few tales of bravery. Among the first to leave were business and professional men, and senior government officials who might have given an example to the other citizens. The doctor in charge of the hospital went absent, and the hospital was left deserted with all its equipment lying around. A prominent group of citizens, angered that their repeated requests to be evacuated before the raid had been ignored, decided to walk out when they were told they had no alternative. Shipping was now halted to all the northwest towns because it was too dangerous with Japanese submarines patrolling the coast, and the only civilian flights still operating into Broome were 2 Lockheed 10s of McRobertson Miller Airlines. It was assumed that it was only a matter of time before at least one of these was shot down and the airline closed down its operation. The only way out was along the track which skirted the Great Sandy Desert and which in the wet was unusable by vehicles. If the Japanese saw them, they would have no protection in the spinifex, but this still seemed preferable to waiting in the town for the Japanese. Their thinking was no different to that of the people of Darwin, and in Broome they did not have a single gun to protect them except for the Home Guard. 67 people set out on this long walk, and with many others already having gone bush, Broome was almost deserted. The Americans had already sent transport for their personnel and had abandoned the town within 3 days, leaving it to face the Japanese undefended. Quote, 10 armed men could have taken the whole town, the aerodrome and the port, unquote, said Captain Lester Brain of Qantas, who was in Broome to organise the flying boat missions between Australia and Java. Businesses had closed, and except for 1 or 2 Chinese restaurants which had escaped looting, the commercial life of the town was at a standstill. There was no meat or milk or fresh bread, and fresh bread was unprocurable. And when morale was at its lowest point, 4 days after the evacuees had left on foot, they walked back into town, angry and exhausted. They told how they had been stopped by a picket hurriedly placed across the road to stop them from going further. There was no room for them in Port Hedland, which itself faced the urgent problem of getting its civilians to safety. Soon after they got back, the position worsened still further, with the departure of the last RAAF personnel, including the Air Force doctor and medical team. This left the town without any kind of medical help. Some of the townspeople had salvaged 2 Browning machine guns from the aircraft that had been destroyed, and the townspeople mounted them in makeshift gun positions, but there was very little ammunition. Even wireless communication with the outside world was difficult because of sunspots and Japanese activity. Liaison between the various arms of the services was almost non-existent. Major General E.C. Plant, the General Officer commanding Western Command, blamed the Americans for much of the trouble. From his headquarters in Perth, he complained that, quote, no information of any sort as to action in that area was received at these headquarters, unquote. The problem was that Broome did not even come within his operational command, but was controlled by ABDACOM in Java. That's American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, ABDACOM. The senior officer in Broome was therefore not answerable to Major General Plant, and being an American naval officer, he would not even have thought of notifying an Australian general 2,000 kilometres to the south. Poor communication almost brought about another disaster, which in hindsight reads more like an episode of the Keystone Cops. 2 days after the raid, Western Command, which still had administrative, though not operational, responsibility for Broome, close bracket, ordered the runway to be prepared for demolition and blown up. 40 engineers immediately began setting the charges. Shortly after the work had started, there was another urgent top-secret communication, this time from the Air Board in Melbourne, who said that the airfield was not to be destroyed unless the Japanese were on the point of landing or the town was abandoned. This message was sent to Perth, where the General confirmed that it was to be destroyed, and the Air Board retorted with a fourth message insisting that it was not. In fact, the problem was very nearly resolved for them. The technique which the engineers were using was to bore 20 centimetre wide holes at 100 metre intervals on the runways to a depth of 2.4 metres. At the bottom of these holes they placed 22 kilograms or 100 pounds of gelignite in waterproof bags. A 2.5 centimetre or 1 inch conduit was then slipped down the hole into the charge, and the hole was backfilled and tamped down. The end of the conduit was left 2.5 centimetres, 1 inch below the surface of the runway, and inside it a fuse with a detonator attached was lowered into the charge. The fuse trailed about 30 centimetres and had to be fired by hand. So they got these fuses sticking out of the runway with the detonators sitting on top of the charge. The first thing that they forgot to do was to incorporate an electric circuit so that the charges would go off simultaneously. Instead, if the Japanese suddenly landed, someone had to rush from charge to charge, lighting each one individually. But even more potentially dangerous was that they had overlooked the fact that when liberators or fortresses landed, they made wheel depressions up to 25 centimetres deep, 10 inches, which tests showed was more than enough to set off the charge from the compression going down the conduit pipe. Even the DC-3 made depressions deep enough to cause an explosion. As a result, the airfield had to be closed to all the urgently needed heavy aircraft for fear that they might blow themselves up as they landed. Rule Britannia, marmalade and jam, 5 Chinese crackers in your runway, bang, 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 boom. The raid caused almost $4 million worth of damage, an enormous loss. Yet during the next 3 weeks, not one representative of any of the armed services visited Broome to undertake salvage work, in spite of the fact that there was a great deal that could have been salvaged, particularly from the flying boats in the bay. Group Captain H.N. Warren, the director of the Meteorological Service in Broome, personally salvaged thousands of dollars worth of valuable precision instruments, including a bomb sight. And on one of the Catalinas he found a complete set of codes that would have been invaluable to the enemy had they followed up the air raid with a landing. Warren destroyed the codes, but there were many similar sets left on other wrecked aircraft which lay there for months, or in many cases until they were destroyed by the salt water. The raids went on intermittently for weeks, but still the army refused to evacuate any more civilians. The Japanese seemed to have good information, and their attacks often coincided with the arrival of a particularly attractive target. One day, for example, a Captain Snook brought his Stinson into Broome at 9:45 in the morning. He had flown in to evacuate some servicemen who had arrived from Java. It was only civilians who were not allowed to leave, close bracket, and after only 45 minutes a single Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over at 4,000 metres. It was travelling fast and circled the town twice before disappearing to the north. Another 45 minutes passed, and then the unmistakable heavy drone of a formation of bombers was heard. Okay, now, they're not suggesting that a single-engined aircraft flew far enough in 40 minutes to get to another island and cause somebody else to take off. It must have flown away and radioed. Perhaps the attacking aircraft were already spotted on the runway and maybe even had taken off and were at their point of no return when they received a radio message from the reconnaissance aircraft. Because, yeah. Another 45 minutes passed, and then the unmistakable heavy drone of a formation of heavy bombers was heard. They flew over in V formation at about 2,000 metres and released more than 40 bombs. They were unusually inaccurate, and most of the bombs fell harmlessly. But as the 7 bombers flew back towards the north, the fighters came in. There were only 2 of them, both zeros. So they've come as top cover for the 7 bombers, and when there's been no fight or opposition, they've dumped their ammunition in the target before going home. Both Zeros, but from a height of 30 metres, they strafed the Stinson, which had been forced to park outside the hangar rather than inside because the door had broken and nobody had mended it. It was totally destroyed and was left a smouldering wreck. It was not until towards the end of April that the remaining civilians were finally evacuated, and by then they were very frightened men. The handful of elderly part-time members of the Home Guard was still the only protection that the town had, and whether this was the effect of the Brisbane Line strategy at work or not, the reality was that the whole of northwest Australia was open to invasion and occupation by a few hundred Japanese at the most. By coincidence or not, April was also the month when General Gordon Bennett arrived in the west to take over from Major General Plant as GOC Western Command. Whether or not Bennett knew of the existence of the Brisbane Line, he could see clearly enough that the Australian High Command was pursuing a policy of concentrating all its efforts on the south-east of the country and ignoring the rest of it. He was not a man to sit back in silence. Revered by his men but mistrusted by his superiors and by the government, he was never given another field command after making a daring escape from Singapore to bring back what he believed was vital information about Japanese tactics. Bracket, a Royal Commission after the war found that he had not been justified in escaping and he should have remained in prison at the head of his men, but that his motives were those of patriotism. Close bracket. From his headquarters in Perth, he made a vigorous stand against abandoning Western Australia without a fight. In a national broadcast he said, quote, "We must not retain all our strength in the populous south in the comfortable belief that the enemy will attack from the east." Unquote. It was the first official hint the people of Western Australia had that what they had long suspected was true, that there was a deliberate policy to abandon them to the enemy. Got that, VB Ed? Bennett resigned from the army in 1944 when it became clear that he would never again be given a field command. But there are some who believe that he was the first senior officer ever to question the correctness of a policy that involved surrendering most of Australia to the Japanese without firing a shot in its defence. Now, the epilogue. After 40 years, it is isolated incidents which spring from the canvas most readily. 3 weeks after the raid on Darwin, bodies were still being thrown up by the sea and, beyond hope of identification, were quickly buried without ceremony or taken out to sea. Tokyo Radio apologised in its English language broadcasts for the bombing of the hospital ship Manunda and for the damage to the hospitals at Larrakia and Berrima. And the Australian flag, which had been flying over Government House while the raid was at its height, was carefully preserved, one of its stars shot away by machine gun bullets and the Union Jack badly damaged. Charles Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, bitter that he had received, he claimed, a kind of justice more suited to a kangaroo court than a hearing presided over by a Supreme Court judge, was never charged and never exonerated. He remained technically the administrator of the Northern Territory until 1946, but with no authority over Darwin or half a dozen other military towns. As War Cabinet had ordered that no further action was to be taken on Lowe's report, even to the extent of getting an explanation from Abbott of all the charges that had been levelled against him, he could act as though the charges had never been made, yet everyone around him knew that they had. He remained in charge of the territory until 1946, must have been a bit bitter that, when he was 60 years old, and he died in 1975, 5 days short of his 89th birthday, and I bet he was thinking up excuses even on his deathbed. His interrogator, Mr. Justice Lowe, never swerved from his insistence that his sole concern had been to try to reach a rapid assessment of what really happened on the 19th of February. Justice, or the lack of it, for Abbott or any of the other witnesses who had appeared before him and were severely criticised, was not his concern. A Japanese landing, he reminded his critics, was imminent or thought to be so, and such niceties as Charles Abbott's administrative incompetence or defects of character were not of great significance within that context. Lowe conducted 3 other royal commissions before he retired from the Victorian bench in 1962. He inquired into the air crash at Canberra in 1940 that claimed the lives of 2 cabinet ministers, the Chief of the General Staff and the Vice President of the Executive Council. He inquired into Eddie Ward's Brisbane line affair in 1943, and he inquired into the Victorian Communist Party in 1949. 5 Provost Corps members, officers, non-commissioned officers and 1 other rank among them, were tried, jailed by court-martial or the civil courts for various offences, including looting, discharging firearms and drunkenness. But there was never any serious attempt to stop the wanton looting that went on for weeks, and no official inquiry at any time to establish why the 3 services, bracket, and the Americans, close bracket, and particularly Major General Blake's Army Command, allowed it to proliferate unchecked. Another Victorian Supreme Court judge, Mr Justice Norman O'Brien, was given the job of working out a formula for compensating those who had lost their property in Darwin, not only as the result of the Japanese bombing, but at the hands of their fellow Australians. A major stumbling block was that the war damage to property regulations, which allowed reparations to be made for war damage, specifically excluded losses caused by looting. Yet the looting had in many cases been in the houses of people forcibly evacuated from the town, or belonging to technicians who were still in Darwin and who were performing essential repair and maintenance work, such as the radio operators and telegraph engineers. The people most responsible for the looting were the very servicemen whom the civilians had been promised would be safeguarding their property. It was a situation that the lawyers who had framed the regulations had never even considered. With considerable common sense, O'Brien worked out a compromise under which the Commonwealth Government employees would be compensated by the government, quote, as a private matter between master and servant to ensure confident and loyal service, unquote. While others were paid reasonable compensation equally by the Army, whose men were the main offenders, by the War Damage Commission and by the Department of the Interior, which had failed to provide civil police protection or any organised civil defence. So that's 1/3 of the bill. The responsibility was people under Abbott's bailiwick. In all, there were 1,300 claims, which I note is one for every civilian that was in Darwin at the time, including one for £14,000 from the Darwin Hotel. Compensation was also paid for property, particularly motor vehicles which had been impressed by the armed services or the civil defence wardens, even though they often had no legal authority to requisition them, and even though much of the material was simply stolen and sent south on the first available merchant ship. The passing of the years has not minimised the ignominy of what happened at Darwin on the 19th of February 1942 and at Broome a fortnight later, but it has allowed it to pass into the broader perspective of history. The weaknesses of so many of those who failed when they were exposed to stress seem less important today than the failure of the government to take proper care and precautions for those Australians who did not live in the comparative security of one small corner of the continent. Certainly the northern coast is little better defended today, he's writing in 1980, than in 1942, with drug runners waiting until the weekend to fly their unmarked light aircraft into Australia, knowing that the Defence Department's radar installations are normally closed outside weekday working hours. We still have many lessons to learn. Finished it. Well, maybe, but in 2014 there's not many drug couriers coming into the northwest end of Australia in a boat because they're too afraid that they'll get mistaken for a people smuggler and be locked up on Manus Island to be shot or beaten to death by the guards, like what happened last week, yeah? One final thing to take away from what happened in Darwin is that when the Australian Imperial Forces came home from the Middle East to get ready to defend Australia from the Japanese, they found themselves training for amphibious operations in the islands, getting ready to use mustard gas against the Japanese. And while that was happening, poorly armed, poorly equipped, questionably led, half-trained militia succeeded in not only stopping the Japanese on the Kokoda Trail, they pushed them back to the north coast, whereon the Australians found that the Americans weren't particularly good at fighting the Japanese in New Guinea, but the Australians seemed to be pretty good at it. And therefore, perhaps, as we can see here on these battle maps, the Australians wound up rescuing the Americans. That says relief of US troops by 6th Australian Division completed 26 November 44. Following which, MacArthur tended to leave the Australians messing around in the islands around Papua New Guinea, while the Americans went on to places like Guam and Okinawa and the Philippines, and actually fought towards the Japanese homeland. So it was as if not only did the Americans not forgive the failure to rescue the Liberator that got shot down off Broome, they didn't really forget the fact that the Australian Army looted Broome after running away and hiding behind the civilians while the Australian Air Force ran away from Darwin. Well, looted Darwin, sorry. So, Australia's Day of National Shame had consequences in that a lot of our troops died in mopping up operations that had nothing to do with the eventual surrender of the Japanese after the American island hopping campaign had given the Americans the ability to firebomb Tokyo and destroy 10 square miles and kill over 100,000 people in one night with a low-level firebombing campaign. So there you have it. End of the series. Australia's Day of National Shame, which could be why Douglas MacArthur did not take the Australians on his island hopping campaign. He let us mess around in the islands off New Guinea to keep us out of his hair in case we ran away again. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat their history. Ciao.